November 1944. Tokyo Bay, the morning air is thin and motionless above the Pacific. Beneath a pale sky, Japan's coastal radar stations hum quietly, their green screens flickering with unfamiliar shapes. In the distance, pilots of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service stand beside their Ki-44 interceptors, waiting for orders that will come too late. Then, through the haze of the upper atmosphere, silver wings appear, vast, glinting, steady. The B-29 Superfortress, flying at 30,000 feet, far above the reach of flak and fighters. Their engines hum with a deep, even rhythm. 4 Wright R-3350s carrying them higher than any Japanese plane can climb. From the ground, they seem almost peaceful. White trails etching slow arcs across a blue canvas, but every contrail marks the path of destruction. Within minutes, bombs begin to fall from the invisible heights. The explosions below echo like thunder, rolling across Tokyo's sprawl. Japanese pilots scramble upward, throttles wide, climbing until their engines cough thin air. None reach the bombers. None even see them clearly. And as the first fires spread through the city's industrial heart, one truth settles across every airfield in Japan. The sky is no longer theirs. By late 1944, the Pacific War had transformed into a struggle of endurance and industry. Japan's empire, once vast and confident, was collapsing island by island under the relentless pressure of Allied advances. From the jungles of New Guinea to the coral atolls of the Marshalls, American forces had learned the hard lessons of amphibious warfare and had begun to perfect them. Each island taken brought the U.S. Army Air Forces one step closer to Japan's home skies. For the Japanese High Command, the warning signs were clear. Fuel shortages crippled their navy. Pilots were being sent into combat with barely 40 hours of flight training, and factories were bombed faster than they could rebuild. Yet even as American submarines cut off vital shipping lanes, Japan's leadership still believed the homeland itself could be defended. They placed their hope in geography, weather, and the supposed limits of American aircraft range. That illusion would not last. In the United States, a technological marvel was nearing completion. A bomber unlike any before. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was designed to fight a new kind of war, one waged from the edge of the stratosphere. It was the most expensive weapon program of the war, costing over $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project itself. Its pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, and enormous range made it a symbol of industrial supremacy. From airfields in India, China, and the Mariana Islands, the Superfortress would soon strike directly at Japan's heart, far beyond the reach of its defenses. American planners called it Operation Matterhorn at first, a logistical nightmare that stretched across the Himalayas. But the mission evolved as the Marianas fell to U.S. forces in mid-1944, providing ideal forward bases at Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. From these islands, the B-29s could reach Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Yokohama, the industrial arteries that fed Japan's war machine. The strategy was simple, yet devastating. Bring the war to Japan's cities, its factories, and its will to fight. The Japanese Air Force knew the bombers were coming. They had seen them tested over China, had intercepted scattered reports of a new American aircraft capable of cruising at heights beyond 30,000 feet. But few believed it could operate in large formations or carry heavy bomb loads across the Pacific. That belief would vanish on a cold night in June 1944, when the first B-29s rose from Chengdu airfields in China and set their course for the Yawata Ironworks on Kyushu. The first bombing raid on the Japanese homeland since the Doolittle raid 2 years earlier. The raid was small, its impact enormous. The Japanese now understood their sky had been breached, and a new age of air warfare had begun. In the summer of 1944, American engineers, logisticians, and airmen converged on the Mariana Islands. Within months, coral runways were carved out of jungle and volcanic rock. Massive hangars rose from the dust. On Tinian, the largest airfield in the world emerged, capable of launching hundreds of B-29s at once. Each base became a self-contained city of steel and fuel, a monument to American industrial will. By autumn, the 20th Air Force under General Hap Arnold and the 61st Bomber Command, led by General Haywood Hansell, had turned these islands into launch pads for strategic devastation. The plan was ambitious: crush Japan's war industry through high-altitude precision bombing. The targets were steel plants, aircraft factories, and urban power grids, the lifelines of an empire stretched thin. The B-29 crews trained relentlessly. Each mission required hours of climb to cruising altitude, oxygen masks frosting, fuel gauges trembling. They flew through jet stream winds no one had encountered before, gales so powerful that bomb patterns scattered for miles. Early results were disappointing. Only a handful of bombs struck their intended targets. But each flight revealed something more valuable than destruction. It revealed control of the air. For the Japanese fighter corps, the challenge was insurmountable. The Ki-43 Oscars and Ki-61 Tonys could barely reach 30,000 feet. Their engines starved of oxygen long before the interceptors reached the bombers. The few that did make contact were shredded by the B-29's remote-controlled 50-caliber turrets, guided by analog computing sites that calculated lead and range automatically. Below, radar operators and anti-aircraft batteries tried in vain to track the formations gliding above thin cirrus clouds. Their shells burst hundreds of meters too low, black puffs fading beneath the silver arcs of contrails. Reports filtered back to Tokyo that some bombers were untouchable, others completely unscathed, despite hours of fire. In the Imperial Palace, military planners debated whether the new American bomber could be stopped. Some urged desperate solutions: suicide intercepts, balloon bombs, even ramming attacks. Others warned that resources were already exhausted. The country's defense now relied on courage rather than capability. Meanwhile, the Americans refined their tactics. Reconnaissance photography guided every strike. Each mission measured success not by single hits, but by the steady degradation of Japan's industrial pulse. The B-29 became more than a machine. It became a statement, proof that American power could reach any point on Earth. By late 1944, the raids intensified. Tokyo's night sky flickered with searchlights and tracer rounds, but the bombers kept coming. For Japanese pilots climbing through turbulent air, the silver formations above the clouds seemed almost celestial, as if the heavens themselves had turned against them. And soon, those silent flights would evolve into something far more terrifying. For the men of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service, the war in the air had once been a contest of skill, courage, and speed. In the early years, Japanese fighter pilots had dominated the skies over China and the Pacific. They had faced inferior opponents and won through instinct and maneuver. But by 1944, that world was gone. Now, every scramble order felt like a ritual of futility. At airfields across Honshu and Kyushu, young pilots clutched their flight goggles and looked skyward, straining to see shapes that never came into focus. The B-29s flew too high, too far, too fast. The fighters that rose to meet them returned with spent fuel, frozen faces, and stories that felt more like legends than combat. The strain was unbearable. The Japanese Air Defense Command was losing aircraft faster than it could replace them. Training schools could no longer produce experienced airmen. The veterans were dead or exhausted. New recruits were boys, some barely 18, trained in weeks rather than months. They were told to attack at all costs, to defend the Emperor's skies, even when their engines failed before they reached enemy altitude. Inside Tokyo, civilians learned to read the sound of approaching destruction. A faint hum at the edge of the sky meant another wave. By the time the sirens began, it was already too late. Families huddled in cellars as bombs fell from invisible heights. The destruction felt impersonal, mechanical. Death delivered from beyond reach. For the pilots, each mission became a test of will rather than skill. They no longer fought for victory. They fought for relevance. The older aces watched their students die in futile climbs, engines overheating, guns frozen by thin air. Some tried ramming tactics, turning their planes into weapons of desperation. Few survived long enough to make contact. On the ground, maintenance crews worked in silence, scavenging parts from wrecks to keep the remaining aircraft flying. Mechanics knew the truth, but didn't speak it aloud. That even if every plane took off, none could catch what now ruled their skies. Above them, the Americans watched the horizon stretch endlessly blue. Their oxygen masks hissed softly as they flew in formation, detached but resolute. They could not see the faces of those below, only the faint orange glow that followed each release. For Japan's defenders, it was not just airspace that was lost. It was the very idea of control, of honor, of possibility. The sky had become an unreachable realm, one they once owned but could no longer touch. And yet, for all their despair, the Americans faced their own challenges, a battle not only against the enemy, but against the elements themselves. To the Japanese below, the B-29 seemed almost otherworldly, a gleaming fortress moving through the stratosphere. But to the men who flew it, the Superfortress was both a marvel and a monster. Each mission tested not only machinery but human endurance. At 30,000 feet, the air was thin and cruel. Frost crept along the windows, metal contracted, oxygen masks froze. Pilots fought exhaustion as they navigated through the violent crosswinds of the jet stream, a phenomenon few had ever encountered. The winds could exceed 200 miles per hour, scattering bomb patterns and pushing the aircraft miles off course. Early missions over Japan were plagued by this invisible enemy. Bombs that should have destroyed industrial plants instead fell into rice fields or harbors. But the Americans adapted with relentless precision. Engineers recalibrated Norden bomb sites. Navigators adjusted altitude, timing, and approach. Meteorologists charted high-altitude wind corridors with mathematical care. Every mission became an experiment in atmospheric warfare, an alliance between human skill and scientific calculation. By late 1944, a new understanding emerged. Technology could outthink nature. While the Japanese clung to valor and instinct, the Americans turned to data, coordination, and production. The B-29 symbolized this shift. It was not a plane for dogfights or duels, but for systems. Every turret was remotely controlled by analog computers. Every strike was guided by reconnaissance photographs taken days before. Japanese scientists and officers who later examined captured bombers were astonished. The pressurized cabin, the central fire control computer, the 3,250-mile range, all spoke of an industry so vast that no single nation could match it. Germany had its jets, but few. Japan had courage, but little fuel. America had factories and time. From Tinian's coral runways, each takeoff was a symphony of coordination. Mechanics, armorers, and ground crews swarmed beneath the silver giants. Fuel trucks lined up in rows. Briefings mapped flight paths across 1,000 miles of ocean. Once airborne, radio silence ruled. The B-29s flew in loose formations, guided by stars and radar, their engines roaring in perfect synchrony. Meanwhile, Japanese radar operators on the coasts of Honshu tracked their ascent. Dots appeared on their green screens, climbing beyond 30,000 feet, higher than any interceptor could reach. Warnings were sent, alarms triggered, but even before the scramble orders were given, the formations had already crossed the coast. In the control towers, commanders watched in grim silence. They could hear the distant rumble, see the faint glimmer of light on metal above the clouds. But they could do nothing. It was as if the Americans had found a new layer of the atmosphere, one that belonged only to them. This technological domination would soon translate into a strategic turning point, a transformation from high-altitude precision to something far more destructive and far more personal. On the night of June 15, 1944, 75 B-29 bombers lifted off from airfields near Chengdu, China. Their destination was the Yawata Iron and Steel Works on the northern tip of Kyushu, the beating heart of Japan's war industry. The mission was codenamed Operation Matterhorn, and though the bombers carried only modest payloads, its symbolism was immense. For the first time since the Doolittle Raid of 1942, Japan's home islands were under direct attack. The flight stretched across the Himalayas, 1,000 miles of turbulence, storms, and unpredictable winds. Engines strained. Fuel calculations were razor-thin. Several aircraft turned back before reaching the coast. Those who pressed on did so at the limits of endurance. Over Yawata, Japanese searchlights probed the sky, their beams slicing through scattered cloud. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire blindly into the darkness, their black bursts blooming below silver ghosts. The defenders were disoriented. They had expected an attack, but not from this altitude, not with such calm precision. From the ground, witnesses later described the sound as distant thunder, not the dive of fighters or the scream of sirens, but a steady rolling hum, followed by a series of concussions that rippled across the night. Fires erupted across the industrial zone, and though physical damage was limited, the psychological effect was seismic. Tokyo's military analysts studied radar data in disbelief. The bombers had entered Japan's airspace, completed their run, and returned to China with minimal losses. Only one aircraft failed to return. For the Japanese Air Command, the implications were devastating. If America could strike from the skies of China, how much farther could it reach once it controlled the Pacific Islands? Within weeks, the answer came. As the U.S. captured Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, the range problem vanished. Japan's homeland now lay within reach of thousands of bombers, operating from bases supplied by the full weight of American logistics. The next wave of raids, launched in November 1944, came not from China, but from the Marianas. Direct, massive, and unstoppable. Hundreds of B-29s climbed into the freezing air and formed up in shimmering columns that stretched for miles. Japanese radar picked them up too late. By the time interceptors rose, the bombers were already overhead, bombing aircraft plants in Tokyo and Nagoya. Below, anti-aircraft batteries fired in desperation, but the bombers flew too high. The sky glowed red over the cities as industrial zones burned. Japanese pilots tried to climb through the smoke, but their altimeters spun uselessly as engines faltered in the thin air. What had begun as a cautious experiment had now become a campaign, one that would change the face of aerial warfare forever. By early 1945, the U.S. bombing campaign had reached a critical crossroads. High-altitude raids had proven technically brilliant, but strategically limited. Precision bombing, though elegant in theory, was failing against Japan's shifting weather and narrow industrial geography. Jet stream winds scattered bombs miles off target, and clouds shielded cities from sight. The war's most advanced bomber was delivering too little, too late. Then came General Curtis E. LeMay. When LeMay assumed command of the Damidiwatro Bomber Command, in January 1945, he brought with him a ruthless logic shaped by Europe's air war. His conclusion was cold and simple. If high-altitude accuracy was impossible, then destruction itself must become the objective. He ordered the B-29s to descend, to fly at night, low and fast, beneath the winds, carrying incendiary bombs instead of armor-piercing loads. The target: Tokyo. On the night of March 9, 1945, the first wave of 334 B-29s rose from the Marianas. Their bomb bays held 500,000 incendiary cylinders, napalm-filled M69s designed to ignite wood, paper, and cloth. The Japanese capital, built largely of timber, was a city waiting to burn. The bombers arrived shortly after midnight. They flew at altitudes as low as 5,000 feet, barely above the reach of light flak. From above, the city unfolded in silence, then erupted in light. Within minutes, entire districts of Tokyo ignited. The flames spread faster than anyone could imagine. Heat rose into the sky, lifting roofs, hurling debris into the bombers' paths. The firestorm consumed everything: homes, factories, water lines, people. Pilots reported seeing columns of fire stretching 20,000 feet into the air. The heat turbulence was so severe that aircraft bounced like toy models. From the ground, survivors said the city turned into a single flame. The temperature reached nearly 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Thousands of civilians were incinerated in moments. Others drowned in the Sumida River, its surface boiling under the inferno. By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo were gone. More than 100,000 people lay dead. More than Hiroshima. More than Nagasaki. The heart of Japan's war industry was ash. Japanese air defenses had done almost nothing. Interceptors failed to take off in time. Radar operators couldn't track the bombers through the heat haze. The Imperial General Staff, shocked and silent, realized that their capital was defenseless. For the American crews returning to Tinian, there was no celebration, only exhaustion, and the memory of a burning world below. Yet the mission had proven one thing beyond doubt. The B-29 had transformed from a high-altitude experiment into a weapon of absolute dominance. And as the smoke rose over Tokyo, the Japanese leadership finally understood. There was no refuge left in the skies or on the ground below. In the weeks that followed the Tokyo firebombing, the truth spread faster than official censorship could contain it. City after city was struck: Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama. Each raid left behind the same images: neighborhoods erased, skylines melted, and survivors wandering through plains of soot and twisted metal. By June 1945, more than half of Japan's major urban centers had been burned to the ground. The Japanese air defense system had collapsed. Radar networks were fragmented, communication lines cut, and fuel reserves so low that even emergency scrambles were rationed. Pilots waited on the tarmac for orders that never came, their planes grounded by lack of gasoline. When interceptors did rise, they often found only smoke, the bombers already gone. From the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito was shown reconnaissance. Photographs, vast grids of cities turned to gray patches. Reports estimated that over 60% of Tokyo's industrial capacity had been destroyed in a single night. The factories that produced rifles, engines, and ammunition were gone. The workforce, mostly civilians and conscripted women, was dead or displaced. Inside the U.S. 20th Air Force headquarters on Guam, mission briefings became routine. Targets were assigned, weather analyzed, formations prepared. Each operation ran like an industrial schedule. To many American officers, the raids had ceased. To feel like battles, they were logistics exercises with catastrophic results. Still, there was no sense of triumph. Aircrew returning from missions described a strange quiet in the debriefings. "It looked like the end of the world," one gunner recalled. "You couldn't tell where the city stopped and the smoke began." For Japan's military, desperation became policy. Fighter pilots were ordered to ram B-29s whenever possible, an act both symbolic and suicidal. Some managed to bring down a few bombers, but for every B-29 lost, 10 new ones arrived from American factories within weeks. The scale was beyond comprehension. By summer, even the Imperial General Staff acknowledged what its pilots already knew. Japan no longer controlled its own airspace. The very sky had become an American domain, vast, mechanical, and mercilessly efficient. And yet, despite the devastation, the attacks were not over. The next phase would bring a new weapon, smaller in number but infinitely more destructive. By August 1945, the B-29 had become a symbol of inevitability, a mechanical messenger of surrender. From the ruins of Tokyo to the untouched valley of Hiroshima, civilians looked upward not with fear, but with resignation. The air raid sirens had grown meaningless. The bombers always came, and there was nowhere left to run. Then, at dawn on August 6th, a lone B-29 named Enola Gay rose from Tinian Island. Its mission unlike any before. It flew without escort, climbing into the high blue silence that had once seemed unreachable to Japan's defenders. Hours later, a single bomb, Little Boy, fell toward Hiroshima. The explosion erased an entire city in seconds. 3 days later, Boxcar, another B-29, released Fat Man over Nagasaki. 2 detonations, 2 blinding suns. For the Japanese people, the raids that once turned cities into firestorms now culminated in pure annihilation. Light brighter than anything ever seen, followed by silence, deeper than any air raid pause. From military headquarters to the Imperial Palace, disbelief turned to paralysis. The once proud pilots of the Empire, trained to fight with honor in the skies, now stood grounded beneath a new kind of warfare, one they could not intercept, one that needed no dogfights or duels. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice echoed through a broken nation. His surrender speech, transmitted over crackling radios, spoke of a new and most cruel bomb. The war was over. The Empire had fallen. Across the Pacific, at air bases on Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, B-29 crews received the news quietly. Many did not cheer. They had seen what their missions had done. One pilot wrote simply in his logbook, "We burned the world to save it." The B-29 Superfortress had achieved its purpose: total strategic dominance from the sky. But in doing so, it had redefined warfare itself. No nation would ever again look at the clouds in the same way. And from the ashes of those raids, a new age began. One where power no longer depended on armies or fleets, but on the cold shadow of the bomb. In the quiet years after the war, the sky over Japan seemed strangely empty. No more silver shapes drifted across the clouds. No more distant engines murmured from beyond reach. The B-29s had returned home, many scrapped or mothballed, but their legacy remained, not in metal, but in memory. For the men who flew them, the Superfortress was both triumph and torment. They had flown higher, faster, farther than any bomber before. They had achieved what strategists once called impossible, striking at the heart of an empire across thousands of miles of open ocean. Yet, in their success lay the shadow of devastation so complete it reshaped the world's conscience. For Japan, the sound of the B-29 became a symbol of defeat, but also of awakening. The war had shown the nation the limits of courage in the face of overwhelming technology. No amount of valor, no number of kamikaze flights, could pierce the calm precision of an industrial superpower that turned the sky itself into a weapon. And for the world, The B-29 story marked the dawn of the modern age. Jet propulsion, pressurized flight, long-range radar, atomic delivery, all were born in that single, relentless campaign of innovation and destruction. What began as the war's most advanced bomber became the blueprint for every aircraft that followed, from the Cold War's nuclear bombers to the peaceful airliners that now trace quiet arcs over oceans. The Japanese pilots who once looked up in despair would later meet their former adversaries not as enemies, but as colleagues, sharing hangars, stories, and a mutual understanding of what the sky had cost them. In the end, the B-29 was more than a machine. It was a message, a warning written in contrails and firelight that human invention, once unbound, could reach heights far beyond mercy. The sky was conquered. But the cost of its conquest would echo for generations.